speech and told me 10 minutes was all right. And I thought, just a speech, and this is weird. So anyway, we get to the restaurant and we sit down and we're in this booth, and she and I are sitting at one side, and Frank is sitting at the other side, and she orders a Harvest Bristol cream. And we start talking about all kinds of stuff, and I said, and she's just been suspended from 20th Century Fox, and I said, well, why don't they want you to do this role? And she said, I had some ideas about that role. She said, and I tried to talk to the director about it, but they wouldn't let me, and when I was persistent, they fired me. I mean, in those days, a star talking to a director, how dare she, So they kicked her out. But what she'd done was she'd been taken in by Milton Green, the photographer, and his family, and she was living with him, and so she was very enthusiastic about all they were going to do together, films and all kinds of stuff, while she was suspended from 20th Century Fox. And so I said, well, if you could do any role you wanted, what would you choose? She said, I'd like to play Grushenka in the Brothers Karamazov. And I was staggered. I'd never even read the Brothers Karamazov. And I said, almost instantaneously, well, I said, I'm not sure they'd take you seriously, because, you're rather an attractive-looking woman. And she said, you look nice, and I'm sure you're good at your job. Well, that stopped me for a while. And so we went on, and I asked her a question or two, and then I said, you're often in the columns. I said, I'm always picking up the columns, and you're in the columns. And Frank interrupted and says, she's only been on 5 covers this month, 5 magazine covers this month. She must be slipping. And so I ignored that. And I said, well, now you're always linked with some bald-faced guy in the columns. What kind of guy do you really like? And she said, I like men who are poets. But she said, that doesn't mean they have to write poetry. Do you know what I mean? And she grabbed my arm and squeezed it. Well, I barely remembered anything after that. We did talk for a while. I remember we talked about all kinds of other things. The so-called interview, was really a conversation. Went on for about 2 hours. And finally Frank said, well, Marilyn, I think we'd better be getting back. It looks like it's going to rain. So she said, oh, okay. So we got up and we started walking down Lexington Avenue, and she said to me, where do you live? And I said, well, I live in Greenwich Village. She said, oh, I've never been there. And I said, well, come down anytime. I'll be happy to show you around. But of course, I never heard from her again. Anyway, what I told you about the book earlier on, Manhattan Memories, was that all these publishers turned it down. And when I summarized why, they all had more or less the same reason, which was, this is not a real autobiography. It's just incidents and episodes and meetings and encounters and reminiscences and interviews. It's not a real autobiography. Thinking again of Angela's Ashes, why wasn't I writing about my miserable childhood, So anyway, I finally published it myself through Lulu.com. But to my amazement, it turned out to be very suitable, in fact, almost perfect for something else. And that was, it caught the attention of 2 cartoonists in Austin, Texas, who decided they were going to make me a comic book hero. They were going to turn my book into a comic book. Well, they've done 64 pages so far. They, in chapter 1, chapter 5 is almost due. In chapter 1, they did the Marilyn Monroe interview, so I thought I would pass this around, and then you've seen it.
I've seen it.
And anybody who wanted to look at it could enjoy themselves. Ask something.
I should ask something. Well, I wanted to go back just to ask one question. I once, there's a writer, Jack Woodford, who became most famous in the 20s, 30s, 40s for writing books on how to write. But he began as a journalist in the Chicago newspapers. And one of the things that he always talked about was that the real news never gets published. That the real news is what the reporters will sit around and talk about. But there's so many vested interests, let's say. And I wondered if you had any experience with that, if you ever found that you were being censored or...
Well, what's interesting about the internet is that for the first time in my life as a journalist, all kinds of secrets are coming out. And not only WikiLeaks, but people are writing stuff that nobody would have dreamed of putting into print a few years ago. And so all the backstories are no longer backstories. And I think that's a tremendous change in journalism. Now everybody these days is a writer, and it seems that everybody's got something to say, you know. So anyway, here I am in the village, and we start the Village Voice. And I finished all my interviews for Rasky in Canada, and I start doing columns. From the very first issue of the Village Voice, I did a front page story, the only byline story on the front page, about the folk singers in Washington Square. Well, of course, that gave our rival, the Villager, their advertising guy, the perfect opportunity to point out to everybody that we were a bunch of communists. I mean, obviously, folk singers, communists, stands to reason, doesn't it? Must be communists, you know. So that didn't help us at all in the beginning. But some of the columns I did was, I did a column called The Chronic Footnote Writer, and it was about this guy that used to write footnotes, but took it out into the real world and went in subways and insisted on writing on every subway step and similar places like that, you know, and about subway stand-up comics, and about how you could be a celebrity by hiring a photographer to follow around and take pictures, whereupon obviously would think you're a VIP, because otherwise why is this guy taking pictures of you all the time? And the new neighbour moved in across the street. I could look across and speculate on her career and her life, and then she read the paper and drew her curtains after that, so that went into that one. And we offered a Greenwich Village scholarship in case some young lady in the Midwest would like to try Greenwich Village and see if that might be an alternative to marrying the local car dealer, you know. So that worked out well. Somebody wrote in and told me about the We Don't Care Society, which existed to promote indifference to things that he felt got hyped too much. That would go over very well today, the We Don't Care Society.
Kardashians. Right.
I used to go in a coffee shop called the Figaro in the village, very well known and wonderful place. I read the proofs of about 6 of my books in there subsequently. And in the Figaro, the waitresses were the stars. Everybody was madly in love with the waitresses in Figaro. It was a real coup to date a waitress. And I looked in the ladies' room. I had one of them look in the ladies' room, and she came out and she told me, Electra loves Agamemnon. Go back to Vassar, Wellesley, Radcliffe, whatever.
So these were graffiti.
These are graffiti in the
she had
ladies' room.
got, yeah.
And Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? And Edward Albee, I think, read The Voice, and I think that's where he got the title. Not from my column, but from the graffiti in the Figaro. He lived in the village. He must have read the Village Voice, and he must have read that column in which I quoted Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, because I doubt that he went to the Figaro. So, and then I used to roam the nightclubs at night and so on, and I was very taken by Woody Allen, and so I grabbed him after a show and I said, I'd like to do a column, Woody, but could we, I don't want to do an interview, could we do something together, you know, and I could write about it? He said, I'll call you. A couple of days later, he says, have you ever heard of, what was it now? I've forgotten the name of it. But it was, Dr. Moreno, psychodrama. Dr. Moreno uptown was giving psychodrama. And you could go and he would pick people out of the audience and have them act out some drama in their life and then reverse the roles with somebody else. And theoretically it would teach you a lot about your thinking, and it certainly taught the audience a lot. So Woody says, you want to go to psychodrama? And I said, sure. He said, you're not going to volunteer, are you? And I said, no. He says, no, me neither. So we go up to psychodrama, and Moreno asked some volunteers, and Woody called Walter Allen, puts his hand up, volunteers immediately, goes out, starts to tell the saga of trying to get a taxi in the rain after coming out of the theatre with his girlfriend, acts like a real jerk. Moreno has him swap roles. Woody gets, whom nobody knows as Woody, it's just this guy called Walter Allen. Woody gets this woman so infuriated, she slaps him. So I thought, well, that's interesting. So anyway, that was a column. And then another column, I had been introduced to Lenny Bruce by Paul Krasner, because Lenny Bruce was opening at the Village Vanguard around the corner from my apartment. So I gave Lenny a key, and he used to crash between shows and go and change his makeup and stuff. And he invited me to opening night around the corner. And the Village Vanguard is very tiny. It's about roughly the size of this area here. Probably can't hold more than 60, 70 people. Owned by a guy called Max Gordon, famous for jazz. And Lenny was opening night in New York. Comes bouncing in, first time he's been heard in New York, looks around the room, says, well, what do we have? Are there any niggers here tonight? Oh, I see a couple over there. How about kikes? There must be some kikes somewhere. Oh yes, here we are. Maybe there's some wet neck in the room somewhere if I can find it. Like him, this is the first thing literally he said. And then he said, I don't know how Max Gordon could afford to give me $1,000 a week for this place. He must be a crook. So anyway, he goes on like that, and that was my first experience of Lenny. So during the course of his in and out of my place, one day my place was being painted, and I left him a note. I said, gee Larry, I'm sorry it's such a mess. When I came back, he was not there, but he left a note. He said, happy house painting. Wouldn't this be a great gift for a diabetic? And he left a whole string of candies across the bed. So that was Lenny Bruce.
Was this before all the famous obscenity busts? And when did that?
Yeah, long, boy. This was in his very earliest days in New York. Yeah, we stayed in touch years afterwards. Of course, I went out to see him in L.A. and I liked Lenny a lot. He was very honest. As a matter of fact, I'll jump forward a bit just because it brings in Lenny. I was hit by a car or a truck when I was driving in Greece many years later, and they took me to hospital, and the two women that were with me were taken to another hospital, and I was all on my own in this hospital, and nobody spoke any English, and everything was broken legs and ribs and God knows what. And I thought of an interesting exercise, which I have also told about 1 million people since, because I think it's a very valuable thing to learn. I thought, well, if I ever get out of here, I wonder who I am. I wonder what my life's all about. What is any point to it all? Can I define myself in any way? And I thought, well, why don't I think of the 10 people who most influenced me in my life up to date, discounting my parents? And I started to think, and I realized Lenny had influenced me. Why? Because he had opened up the theater like it had never been opened before. He had said things on stage that I don't think anybody ever said before an audience before. Henry Miller, well, when I first read Henry Miller, he was banned in the United States. You had to smuggle him in from Mexico. And I read Henry Miller's Tropics books, and I thought, how can anybody be so frank, so personal, so open, so confessional? It's just amazing. I wouldn't dare to write anything like that, and I don't know anybody else who does. So here we have two people. And then I thought, well, Warhol has influenced me a tremendous amount because he really defined what art was. And Tim Leary, who I first met when I was researching my book on Mexico and $5 a day. I went to a dinner party in Cuernavaca, and Tim Leary, then a professor at Harvard, was down there researching psilocybin. He'd never taken any before. Years later, I was one of the test subjects. 600 people took psilocybin and had to fill in forms about whether the influence was alive. Anyway, what I concluded from this, these people, and there may be others, was that apparently I like people that push limits. I was much too much of a scaredy cat to push limits myself, but I was really envious and in awe of people that did. And maybe that taught me something about my role as a journalist and as a writer. Maybe that was a place for me to report on people who did push the limits. Anyway, that's by the way, and it's ahead. We'll get back to the village and working for the Village Voice. I went to a party and I met a guy called Bud Waldo, very genial, matter-of-fact guy. And I really enjoyed the party. He had a huge loft, and there weren't that many people there. And so I went up to him and I said, would you be interested in sharing a party? We both kick in $5 for a keg of beer, and we both invite people. And he said, sure, let's try that, it'd be interesting. So I went home and I printed a lot of little cards saying, next party at, on, BYOB, bring your own bottle. And we started giving parties. And I met people in the subway and gave them little cards. Met people when they talked to me when I was in my hammock. And everybody that looked interesting, I gave a card. All these people turned up at these parties. Judy the singer. Judy Collins, she turned up at one. Woody turned up at one. Keith Hefner's brother turned up at one. All kinds of people. For years afterwards, people were telling me that met the wife at my party, or met somebody who'd hired them, the boss, or whatever. It was a really, game-changing thing, those parties. Anyway, at one point, the voice came to me and said, we've run out of money, and we'd like you to keep doing the column, but unfortunately we can't keep paying you the generous $25 a week we've been giving you. And so I said, oh, I'll have to get a job. So I contacted New Yorker, and they granted me an interview.
New York Times? Or
New Yorker.
New Yorker.
Yeah, so I went to this interview, and it was a very Zen-like occasion. It was an older editor, and his mind was totally elsewhere. And he said that he talked about people who had gone from the magazine to work at Time and come back. And he said the last guy said that over there the housekeeping was brilliant, but the editing wasn't so good. And that was interesting to me, he said, because that's totally reverse of us here at the New Yorker. So I kept reminding him I was there for an interview, and he said, I did talk to one of the writers the other day. He said, I'd never met him before. I think he's been here about 4 years, but he'd never had anything published. And so the editor, that would have been William Shawn, the editor asked me if I would give him a word and cheer him up a bit. So I did that, and I never got him back on the subject of why I was there applying for a job. And the interview went okay, and I left, and I never heard from them again. What's his name? Ethan, the cartoonist, did this as a two-page panel, my interview with my Zen-like interview in the New Yorker. So I had it framed and I sent it to the current editor as a gift. But he thanked me, and I never heard from him again either. So anyway, then I thought, well, I've really got to take this serious. I've got to get a job. There were about 7 papers in New York at the time, so I wrote to all of them, and I wrote to all the magazines, and tossed in a couple of PR firms and so on, and absolutely nobody would pay me the slightest attention, except I got one reply, and it was from the New York Times, and they hired me. I went for an interview and they hired me. They were impressed by the fact that I worked for big papers in London or in England, and they had a vacancy in the travel department, so I became one of the 7 travel editors in the travel department. And I used to ride uptown on my folding bicycle, which I'd got by writing about the Japanese company in my column who sent me a bicycle. And I sort of got the reputation of being a bit of an eccentric. And my job at the Times, apart from editing stories, was to go down to the composing room, and in those days of hot type, the composing room had all these rows of huge linotype machines. And these guys would sit with a sheaf of stories in front of them and type away, and every line came up as a solid metal type about that deep with the words of the line in reverse on the top of it. It was a kind of alloy. I think it was probably zinc and copper, not copper, maybe lead, something. But every single line had a corresponding metal line. And they would then take all these lines over to a big metal thing exactly the size of a page, and they would drop all these lines into the various columns along with the heads and everything. And my job, when I would go down there, would be to stand at one side of this big form, and the printer would stand at the other side, and although he was reading these words, these lines in reverse, he was really used to it. It was very simple to him. And he would say to me, we need 2 lines cut from here. So I would not only be reading it upside down, but in reverse, and I'd say, those days, don't touch, don't touch. If you touched anything, the entire floor would go out on strike. The unions were so strong, you couldn't touch anything. You had to really stay aloof from it all, you know. So that was one of my jobs.
John, I want to interject that in the late 70s, I also started doing illustrations for the New York Times.
Right.
And I was given a tour of the very same line of typesetting. It was a huge floor with these, 7-foot tall machines. And incredibly, this was how type was set, from 1890 when they invented these machines, as opposed to plucking each letter, from the case one by one. So now you had at least a machine that would, compose a line at a time. And I remember the art director that I worked with telling me that they really wanted to switch to computer type, but the union wouldn't let them. So it was many years that they had to stay behind the times because of the union. Allowing them to.
Unions were very, very powerful.
Yeah.
Anyway, so my other job was to edit stories. I also learned another trick, a writer's trick there. Herb Metgang was a magazine writer at the Times, and I admired his story one day. I admired one of his stories one day, happened to be on the same floor. And he said, I always try to get motion into my stories. I thought, wow, that's a good tip. Try and get motion into your story. So one day I'm editing this story from Peggy Durden, who was the New York Times wife in Hong Kong. Her husband, Tilman Durden, he and she run the Hong Kong bureau of the New York Times. So I'm admiring her story, which I've just edited, and she said, well, why don't you come out and visit? Well, I'd never thought of that before. That was a good idea. So I took 2 weeks leave of absence, added to my 2 weeks vacation, and I went to Pan Am, and I got a round-the-world ticket. And I went to Hong Kong, and she introduced me to, she gave me an introduction to Jim Thompson in Bangkok. And Jim Thompson, who was an ex-CIA guy, became very famous later because he disappeared. To this day, nobody knows where he went. And he was the man who revived the Thai silk industry. He went around to all these homes and admired the silkworms and showed them how they could become part of a nationwide silk industry. So that was Jim Thompson. And in Karachi, I learned to play strip chess with one of the women who worked at one of the hotels. Strip chess is a very interesting game. And I went back.
Did you feel like a pawn?
Yes. And then I met Arthur Fromer. And one night I was having dinner with my then girlfriend, and he said, you know that guy Arthur Fromer you met? Well, he's looking for something on Mexico. I said, really? I said, I put down the night before and I went to the phone and I called him up and I said, well, I've done all this stuff at the Times, but I'd like to write your book on Mexico. So he hired me, and I as a matter of fact, this was the very first one. Mexico on $5 a day.
Show the picture of you on the back. Here's the young, handsome John Wilcock.
Can we pass it around?
I'd like to interrupt here real quick. This is my copy, my mother's copy, of Greece and Yugoslavia on $5 a day,
wow.
with her notes, and I'm going to ask you to sign that.
That's so cool.
So, I wish I could have gone when it was $5
Can
a
we
day.
pass this, John? Is
I
that
put
okay?
it away. Yeah, no fuss about it. It's okay.
Yeah. Well, it won't disappear, but it's valuable.
Oh, actually won't. Well, I was literally trying to live on $5 a day in the tone of the book. So I was traveling on third-class buses with my neighbor's chicken on my lap and staying in hammocks for $1 a night. Peso was 12 cents at the time. Staying on beaches in hammocks for $1 a night and hearing the fishermen catching shrimp, which I would then have for breakfast half an hour later. And Mexico, and then at one point, when I went to Mexico several times, I went to all countries that I did books on several times to update and revise them. And one time in Mexico I had a battered old car, and I hit a cow and hobbled to the next gas station. And as I drove into the gas station, the guy looked at me and says, "Oh, vaca," meaning a cow. He knew I'd hit the cow, you know. So that was Mexico. And then I went, and I told you I met Leary in Mexico. He was investigating psilocybin. This would be early 60s we're in by now. It's taken an hour to get to the 60s. So anyway, then I went to do a book on Japan. Japan on $5 a day. Which I think, yeah. Japan on $5 a day.
I like these covers.
And I loved Japan from the start. It was
There's
absolutely fabulous.
Studious John.
I just thought it was just absolutely great. They used to have these coffee shops, jazz coffee shops, with all the latest records from the States on the wall and playing, and they would serve you the coffee in gorgeous little earth, you know, the sort of, what do they call, very delicate coffee cup stuff, you know, in those cups. And on the saucer would be two little candies in transparent wrappers. One would be red and one would be green. They were really into the aesthetics, the Japanese, which I admired from the start. But there was also another aspect of Japan which is very popular. They had what they like to call Turkish baths. And you went to these baths, and all these women were lined up, these perky young ladies with a halter and a short skirt and a towel over the shoulder. And you would pick one of them to give you the massage, you know. And you'd go down and she'd dump you in the hot tub, and then she'd massage you, and then she'd lean over and she'd say, "Special massage?" And you say, yes. So then she'd take the towel and she'd hang it on the door and close the door, on the outside of the door, and close the door again, which would indicate the special massage inside. So I used to love special massages. Really always been depressed that the regular massages don't have a special massage. I guess it costs a lot extra. Anyway, so then I was in Greece, and things were terribly simple in Greece in the early days. And for example, there were only 2 or 3 dishes on every taverna's menu, but they did have 3 salads. You could either have a tomato salad, a cucumber salad, or a tomato and cucumber salad. And the really flashy restaurants, of course, would have a Greek salad, which would add some, the Greek cheese, feta, and if you were lucky, anchovies. So it was terribly simple, Greece. And one of the things I remember writing about was how appealing it was, just because it was so simple. There were so few choices, so little to do except bask in the sun and lie on the beach. And there were nude beaches in Greece, and always have been. And it was just so great. And you'd get on and when you got bored, you would look the next morning for a ferry, and you'd take a ferry to the next island. And as you got off the ferry at the next island, there'd be all these people, you'd never been there before, and all these people had been coffee shops, all enjoying themselves and talking, swapping newspapers. It was like a huge party. And you think to yourself, oh shit, all these people know each other, and I'm really going to be out of it here, I'm a stranger, you know. Well, the next day, you'd be sitting down at the thing and talking to everybody and swapping papers and stuff, and the people would be coming off the ferry and say, "Why do these fucking tourists come here?" So anyway, Greece was sort of like that, and I met, I used to go on a cruise run by the Kokonis, Swedish brothers who ran Viking cruises, and these boats had about maybe a dozen people on them. And I went on several cruises, so by the time I went on the 2nd or 3rd, I knew the routine, and I could, by then having my video camera, I could plot the scenario in advance, and I would say to people, I would say on the camera, "Well, that woman over there, she's the one that's going to have a different dress every meal this week. And that guy over there, he's going to tell jokes all through the week, and they're going to get dirtier and dirtier." And of course, everything always happened the way I predicted, because I'd seen it so often. And so one day I'm on this cruise, and when it ends, I get off the cruise, and I'm walking through the harbour, and here's this really great boat nearby, moored, and a woman who looks like Ingrid Bergman, only younger. And she said, "You've just come off that cruise?" And I said, "Yeah, it was great." She said, "That's not a cruise." She said, "We take our boat and we have our own cruises." And I said, "Well, sounds great, you know, but how are they different?" She said, "You can come if you like." So I said, "Really?" She said, "Yes, a couple of days, come here and we'll take you on a cruise." So there was her and an English girl, like, I don't know, called Babs or something or other. And so I got on board with them a couple of days later, and by probably not my design, ended up sharing Jovanka's bunk, which very much annoyed Babs, who apparently had been doing it previously. And Babs got so annoyed one day that she screamed and yelled and said, "You let him get away with things and he doesn't have to do the dishes," and, you know, just really yelling around him. And she ran and jumped off the boat. And we both thought she was like going to drown herself. So we brought her back and everything was smoothed out and we worked out. It was a good trip. We had a great time. And Jovanka was one of the two women I was with years later when I was driving through the Peloponnese and we got hit by a truck, which is why I ended up in hospital in Greece. But anyway, anything else about Greece? There's a very interesting temple, a bus ride north of Athens. It's a place called Rhamnous, and it's the temple of Nemesis. And Nemesis is the god you should all be looking out for, because Nemesis is the answer to hubris. Is that the word, hubris?
Hubris?
Hubris. Too much hubris. Nemesis will beckon you, right? So I was very aware of Nemesis in the very beginning, and the statue itself is now in the British Museum, but there's the stand for it is still there, and of course the temple is still there. Temple of Nemesis. And the story is that way, way back in 5th century BC, the Persians were really pissed off with the Greeks. They just really had enough of the Greeks. And they decided they were going to go over and teach those Greeks a lesson. And so they went over and they took this big chunk of stone with them. And they were going to carve a victory statue when they won the battle. Well, they lost the battle very severely. And the Greeks took the long chunk of stone and carved the statue of Nemesis, which was very appropriate, of course. So when I started to do my books about magic in later years, I did 3 books about magical sites around Europe and South America. That was obviously a place in the magic book.
Well, John,
Right?
why don't we stop here for
Right.
a moment? We're at the hour mark, and we'll do a little 10-minute, walk around. And,
Yeah, okay, that's a good idea.
we can get some refreshments up here, and then we'll come back, and we've got Andy Warhol to talk about, and a lot of interesting things. More travels, and
Yeah, I'm not
So-
even halfway through, I regret.
just a little short break.
May have to condense it all in the end.
Great.
Bye.
Bye.